Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the August 18th meeting of the Dartmouth School Committee Equality and Diversity Subcommittee meeting. Per Governor Baker's order suspending certain provisions of open meeting law, GLC 30A Section 20, and the legislature's extension of that executive order, the public will not be allowed to physically access this Diversity and Equality Committee meeting. Members of the public can access the meeting via live stream at www.youtube.com/DHS-TV media. The school committee reserves the right to implement additional remote participation procedures and will notify the public of these procedures as soon as is practicable. So I have some notes about what open meeting law says, this new remote. Dr. Gifford, it says we should record in the notes that all members are attending remotely. And we will start with a roll call to open the meeting. So you can just say yes or present when I call your name. Mr. Hayes.
Present.
Mr. Tebow.
Present.
Ms. Bloom.
Present.
Ms. Chamberlain.
Present.
Ms. Massari.
Present.
Ms. Murphy.
Present.
Ms. Scott.
Yes.
Ms. Amaral.
Here.
I am also here. I am present. Ms. Pamfield is not here and Ms. Walker is not here. All right, so we just have a few things on the agenda. The first is a presentation in support of the mascot. I forward you all an email from Mr. Ventura and Mr. Pereira. On August 1st, after the school committee met to decide to not allow public access to meetings, I sent them an email to invite them to present to our committee. I did not hear back from them. And so on August 9th, I followed up with them to see if I could get any information from them. I went out of town on vacation, so I asked Ms. Genther to follow up with them. But because we had to post the agenda, and I had not yet heard back from them, I asked Ms. Genther to put that on the agenda so that if they decided to come, we would have publicly posted that. On the 11th, after I left for vacation, they responded stating that they will not be able to attend due to short notice. They said they are open to presenting at future meetings. And they, as you see from their email, they referenced the email from Miss Andrews Mateus, who's the chair of the Wampanoag tribe, that the tribe be engaged in further discussions. They recommended that the tribe should consult with us first, and that's sort of what the end of their email notes. I also forwarded you all today, you should have received, I got an email from I think it was the National Congress of American Indians, also asking to provide testimony to the committee in opposition to the mascot. I would also like to note for the record that the other federally recognized tribe in Massachusetts, the Mashpee Wampanoag, have submitted a letter to the state legislature, and it is publicly posted in opposition to the use of native mascots. All right, so I want to sort of be clear about the full range of sort of opinion here. I apologize for the presentation. We were not able to do that tonight, but I did want us to meet and to have a discussion about how to move forward. One of the things I think I want to highlight, while I suspect that Ms. Andrews and I disagree on the mascot issues, I do agree with her on the issue that and maybe I think this is a way forward for the committee, is for us to have a discussion about how we engage with our Native neighbors around education, around educating the community, not just historical, but also contemporary. And maybe that might be something that this committee can focus on. I also know you probably all saw that the select board asked for public input. Again, at the last school committee meeting, given sort of the rate of transmission in the community, We did not open our meetings to the public, so they're not open to the public yet. We could proceed with a virtual public comment. If someone would like to volunteer to put that together and moderate that, that's one way forward. Alternatively, we can sort of maybe move forward on some educational issues, working with tribal partners, while we wait till we have the ability to have some sort of public comment, or perhaps there are other options. So what I wanted to do was to sort of open it up. Again, this is really the only way we can have discussions about how to move forward. Sometimes it would be nicer to be able to do it via email, so we wouldn't all have to give up, some time in our summer, but we have to comply with open meeting law. So I just want to sort of turn it over to you all and hear maybe what your thoughts and ideas are about how we might sort of move forward on the Mascot issues, working with tribal partners, other things that we might be able to do. Ms. Amaral.
I'm leaning toward what you're saying in terms of like supporting in the meantime, partnering and meeting with and our tribal partners. I think that would be certainly rich and meaningful and important. So that's my thought.
Ms. Murphy.
So I do have a couple of questions. I have some ideas too, which I'd like to talk about tonight with this extra time, but I'm wondering if we can get some clarity or maybe talk about the lack of clarity around just this idea of the select board now weighing in, excuse me. And like whose jurisdiction this whole decision is within.
This is completely and wholly and unambiguously the jurisdiction of the school committee. I've had conversations with MASC about this. This is the Massachusetts Association of School Committees, and they have been unambiguous about this. This is the school committee's purview. So the select board can hold hearings. They can do what they want. They're the select board. But the decision about this rests with the school committee.
Okay, thank you.
All right, so did you have other things you wanted to share with us, Ms. Murphy?
Yeah, I'm coming to the end of my vacation, so I've been thinking about this more as I'm kind of easing back into work and what's ahead. And I will say this, so after the last meeting, I think right at the start of the July meeting, I actually received the letters that were sent because there was some confusion and those of us who aren't school employees didn't get them right away. So I spent some time really going through, particularly Miss Andrews Maltese's letter from the Aquinnah Wampanoag. And I have to say that I really found that letter to have deep within it a lot of, I think it was perceived in the media, let's say, as like the Aquinnah tribal leaders want to keep the mascot in Dartmouth. And while I guess that's maybe a quick read, I found that there was a lot in there about really talking about, we are concerned about erasure, as we've heard, right? We don't, if this is all we've got in Dartmouth, we don't want to get rid of it. And I've been thinking so much about that over the course of the last month, because that is really sad and really true in so many ways. And I think that if we can focus, and if we have to pivot here and say we're going to put our public comment on hold while we figure out how to do it online, perhaps, what can we be doing in the meantime? And I think that we can be thinking about those ideas and those potential collaborations now, whether we're voting yay or nay on keeping the current mascot or not. And a couple of the things that I've come up with again, and I think we should invite people to the table. It was great to just see this letter come in from the NCAI that they would like to speak to us. Again, I would like to see us make sure that they understand that we can't just do that on the last day because of all this public meeting stuff. I feel bad when those kind of things happen. But what can we be doing now, right? To move forward and say, we're not sure where we're going with the ultimate decision, but how can we actually work to bring more of Wampanoag culture and history into our community? I do have ideas on that. I don't know if other people want to talk, or you want me to go through my list of things, or how we want to do that.
Well, given, if it's okay with the committee, given that you've been thinking about it, maybe it would be good for you to share some of those ideas with us, and then we can discuss those ideas, add some of our own, and think about how to move forward with that.
Okay. So again, keeping in mind the letter that we received, and also the letter that came from Mr. Pereira and Mr. Andrews and Mr. Ventura, I believe, where they were talking also about not wanting erasure, and they kind of pushed back a little bit on some of the things that we heard from Dr. Davis Delano 2 months ago, right? And saying, well, we can't educate the public. And she said it's hard to educate the public, and they said, well, of course we can. And so because I am not a curriculum expert, but I do know a little bit more about the challenges of educating the public and getting parents to show up at things that are not mandatory. I think that we have to think creatively about how to do that. And I think that we can do it, but I think that it is not, let's host an information night and see who comes up, who shows up to learn about this. But how can we really say, we, regardless of the decision that is made on the current mascot, we as a school department and a community in Dartmouth care about educating and informing our community about the history of these lands and the culture that was indigenous, right? So one of the things that I thought about was, again, of course, how we bring people together, as we've talked about, and actually have some type of advisory committee or roundtable or something where we can get those voices in the mix to actually start to think about doing the work. The first thing that I came up with is I know myself personally, I need a lot more education, and I would think others share in this, in terms of talking about land acknowledgements, when we hear people do land acknowledgements and what that means. But if we think about how we get tribal indigenous leaders to explain to us and help advise us, let's tell them what we're thinking and let them, give some feedback. How do we appropriately acknowledge the lands in which we are now operating? So that's one thing, and I think that we could do that effectively when we have public events. If the national anthem is being played, maybe that's the distinction of how we decide when we're going to do this. Maybe it's something that actually gets posted in the schools in a written form. I don't know. I do know that there are lots of people that know a lot more about this. So that's one thing. The next thing is that, again, because that's getting people the information when they're already at something else, right? We know that people come to the band competitions, they come to the sporting events, they come to honor society, they come to anything in this school. So we have to meet them where they are. Another idea that I had is talking about actual physical space for kind of dedicated Wampanoag history and current day culture things. And again, thinking in terms of our space is limited, obviously. Our funds are limited, but I do think we can fundraise for these things. But we have spaces where the public tends to come in each of our schools. And we all know, I think if we think about that, it's around music, the arts, and sports. And our elementary schools and our middle school get a lot of use in the evenings for DYAA, DGAL, all that kind of stuff. This is where people are in our lobbies. They're a captive audience, so to speak, in terms of waiting for the next thing to happen, right? So if we were to say that one of the things that we wanted to do was, let's put up some boards or take some boards or whatever that are there and say, we're going to have a rotating sort of display of history, current culture, different types of things that are put together by students at different schools of different ages, the High School Diversity and Equity Club, partnerships with Plymouth and Patuxent, whatever the case may be. But we're actually saying, like, we're going to do this and we're going to prioritize it and we're going to do it well and we're going to have them printed and they can be sort of like a rotating museum type display. So what's at Quinn for 2 months might rotate to DeMello School the next 2 months. And so we build these materials and then we can use them effectively and get the word out, get the public seeing them when they come into schools. And then the other idea I had, of course, is our stadium is our biggest venue. It is outside and it is where a lot of the largest, traffic moves through with sports and band, et cetera. So we could think about putting together some type of more like the museum displays that you see outside that you kind of walk by that kind of give us, I don't know what this would be, a history of the lands, the settlement of Dartmouth by white people after that, the changes in the mascot and the representation over time. I know there was some mention in some of the letters too about giving proper credit to Mr. Andrews for his design of this logo and these types of things. We would have to do this in partnership with different voices, but to say, here's a physical representation of our commitment to wanting this information to be out in the public. So we're talking about it as land acknowledgements, and we're also encouraging you then to look at this history when you visit the stadium once or another time or whatever like that. So those are kind of the ways that I think we can start to think about if we want to have a conversation, maybe with tribal representatives and other community members. What's the starting point? Like, what are we even talking about trying to do? And I do think public education is super important because, yes, the curriculum stuff is super important on a whole different level, but there are a lot of moving pieces to that. And we're still only getting the students. We're not getting the rest of the community, which I do think is important. So that's kind of the basics of what I had thought about so far.
So I think just to sort of highlight, I think common elements through all this is that there's opportunities, I think, not just for student learning, but also for community learning, because I think some of the stuff that you're talking about, we're already doing some of this stuff throughout our curriculum, right? And so part of it might be thinking about, well, as we're doing that in our curriculum, how do we create assignments, artifacts that could then be also used to educate the public, which I think is, it sort of doubles the effect of that. And as an educator, I'm also always a fan of, engaged learning where students can do something and then they can see that it has a real world impact, right? Like if you're a kid and you make a poster board and people are standing around it talking about it, that's really cool. Like you learn that, words matter and the things that you say and do can have an impact. So it sounds like what you're suggesting, and you have several examples of this, is, sort of working with the tribes and then figuring out ways to create these things, maybe in our schools, whatever they may be, a stadium display, a land acknowledgement, public displays, that we could then, educate the community with. So building that connection in multiple ways. Thoughts? I hate to put this on Mr. Tebow, but I always hear stuff like this and I think, wow, these would be cool, sort of some of these cool projects for something like, I don't know if you could integrate it into an AP capstone or something like that. Or an internship project or something like that for some of the high school kids, or maybe it's something a club takes on, but that might be something that we could explore, right? Some independent learning projects for high school students who are capable of doing this sort of work.
Yeah, so I think there's a lot of different ways it can be done at the high school. Certainly independent individual students can make it part of their their research. But we have a number of clubs, and Ms. Chamberlain advises one of them, the Multicultural Club, but there's a number of clubs that can certainly, there's no shortage of bulletin boards at the high school. It's actually one of the things I don't like, because there's so many, it's impossible to maintain them all. And so an empty bulletin board looks lousy, right? But we certainly have a number of clubs that are dedicated to this type of work that could certainly take on, a rotating display, as was kind of explained.
Right. So, Mr. Parati just chimed in too, that, right, this is something that his students could work on. I know they do a lot of amazing video projects, podcasting, blogging, and that, you put that up on YouTube and that could be accessible to a lot of people. So I think there's a lot of ways that we can sort of integrate this into our curriculum and our learning experience, I guess. So I like that idea. Ms. Amaral, you said you sort of like that idea of moving forward on some of these issues. Do we think that's what we want to start working on? And then I guess the other question would be sort of how would we do this, right? And so there's some complications. There's some limitations, right, on all of us meeting because we have regular jobs and it's slow because we can't do it all the time. And so the question is whether it would make more sense. Would it make sense for us to do this and to invite, or would it make sense to, I think this would have to go to the school committee probably, to ask the administration, right, to maybe create some sort of group. And I mean, I'm happy to sit on it but the actual implementation would have to be a little bit on the school side if we're involving students. Dr. Gifford, maybe I might ask you some of your thoughts about that.
Well, to be honest, I'm overwhelmed at the moment of those
Right.
thoughts.
I think we'd want to wait, right, like until school is started, we're going a little bit, we see how the year is going before we pick this up.
Yeah.
Sure. But once the train has started leaving the station, maybe, do you think that might be something?
Yeah, we do follow the standards, and we do have many grade levels that incorporate various studies on the Native Americans already. So I think a starting point is more to analyze that a little bit. And when you were speaking about some of these things, my thinking was it's more than the school department. Once again, it's a community effort. Like, what about the public libraries? If you're thinking of moving, rotating museums and stuff. I really hesitate to really get hugely in depth with some of this starting the school year, because to be frank, last week I'm inundated with COVID response protocols and meeting with DESE, and it's really pretty overwhelming right now. And, I don't want to shortchange the topic, but I think it's better to analyze what the curriculum is including already, and how we might move forward with that before and again, maybe some of the community groups might want to take up some of that cause as well, because it's a great cause. It's just put more on few people, again, becomes a little bit much, to be honest.
So the other question is, I know we've had other groups that have offered to sort of help with this effort. I know Dr. Hall, who heads the New Bedford NAACP, the Dartmouth Democratic Town Committee has reached out. So another thing we could do is we could ask for volunteers to work with some of the tribes to help create that sort of stuff, at least as a short-term start. That's another way that we might do this. I do know, right, I don't even get half the number of emails probably that you get, Dr. Gifford or Mr. Tebow, about the start of the school year, but I'm getting a lot of emails just as a school committee member. So that is a challenge, but we could reach out to some partners about working with local tribes and helping to create some of the sort of things that Ms. Murphy has talked about to start, if we want to make some progress in this early in the fall.
Also, if you want to expand beyond Native Americans, et cetera, just as an aside, I have had a conversation with, it must be Dr. LaSalle, I imagine. we're meeting in September via Zoom, early September. I asked him, through the NAACP to be part of the group that gives us feedback on the ESSER 3 grants, as we needed to reach out to civic, the organization, civil rights organization. So might be able to mention something about it at that point too, because again, expanding beyond the Native American group, if we're thinking of diversity and all of it, just another.
Right. So I think though, right, to start, right, the focus would be on sort of native history, right? And at that aspect that Ms. Murphy talked about, educating the public, that sort of dual role. I'm wondering if, I'm trying to think, anybody has other ideas or thoughts, please feel free to jump in. Ms. Amaral.
Nothing really new, but I just wanted to say that, after reading, the news and reading what, the media, locally kind of reported on it, and then hearing that, I guess on Monday we'll receive a letter as a school committee from the select board, I felt a little bit like I was in a soap opera, right? I'm looking through a glass, like that's not really what's happening. That's not really, but I had a wonderful conversation with Jacob Ventura today, who had been trying to get in touch with me, but life is crazy. And it was quite reassuring, because a lot of the stuff that you talk about, Elizabeth, we talked about. And it was nice to hear that don't believe all you read, and that there's some humanity in this, and that there's a lot of common ground where we can come at it from a certain point and kind of, that's beautiful. So it was really reassuring to hear, and I'm excited about your ideas. And I just, I don't know where we're going with this. And I think it needs to go somewhere, regardless of what, happens. Whether the state comes and tells us we need to change it before we get to it, because clearly we've got a lot of COVID stuff going on the onset of getting into school. But I just wanted to share that, because, you often kind of think a certain thing, and then when you talk to the people and you hear there is a lot of common ground, and we can work with that, right? That's a really great place to start. So that's it.
I do think this is the area of common ground, that we all agree that we want to sort of honor Native history, Native culture, right, and our partnership. And so working on sort of that education is the way to do this. So I think there's a couple of complicating factors right now, right? Probably even last time we met, we were all like, it's going to be a normal fall. It's great. We can work on this. And it's kind of gone like this, right, since our last meeting. And so that does complicate what we're doing, in part because I know on our campus, in the schools, we're all overwhelmed with the logistics of getting school open and schools open safely. And that has to be our number one priority. And I don't want to take away the focus from our administrators or our teachers or staff about, to do this, because that's what we've got to focus on first. So that complicates this a little. The other thing that's sort of really complicating is, okay, their bandwidth is all really taken up now. We could do work on this group, right? But we're sort of bound by open meeting law. And that's not to say that I don't want people to be involved in the process or aware of it, but it means that in normal situations, you have back and forth conversations, right? You pick up the phone, you talk to someone, you bounce a few emails off of each other. We can't do any of that. We can only work together as a group. So I guess the question is whether we ask someone else who might not be bound by open meeting law to do some of this work with our tribal partners, to create some of the things that we might put in schools, like Ms. Murphy talked about, and to present them to us, or whether we take a pause for a month or so, while at least a month, while we get up and running and figure that out. I think that's because I don't think we can do this work in this committee. Maybe we can, I don't know. I'm sort of thinking out loud as we go through this, right? Ms. Amaral?
One thing that just came to mind that I'm wondering, and it might be available, but our the Google Drive where we were sort of uploading, and we talked about making that accessible to the public for viewing and to read through some of the things that we've compiled there. Is that something that is available for folks? Is there a link for
It
folks
is,
to
it
kind of?
is on my list of things to do, but
Okay, no, yep.
I have not gotten to that.
Dr. Jenkins, if I may,
Yes,
Jonathan
Mr.
Galasha.
Galashaw.
You did mention that to me. It is something I was looking to. Obviously, we can have a Google Drive for us, this group, excuse me, but for the public as well. That's something I've got to help with.
Yeah,
Sorry.
and I haven't reached out to Mr. Galashaw because if we're gonna make it available to the public, it's gotta be clean and they have to understand what stuff is, and I just haven't had the time to get to that. It is on my list. I'm wondering, go ahead,
Janet.
Ms. Chamberlain.
I'm on vacation. I can do that. I'll do that. I'll clean it up and you can look at it and we'll move that along.
Fabulous. Ms. Chamberlain, thank you, Ms. Murphy. Ms. Chamberlain.
I mean, I feel like we got this letter today from the National Council, and we also got the letter from the woman on Martha's Vineyard. I mean, does anybody besides me wanna, I feel like we need to be including some Indigenous voices in our conversation here, and that's been said to us on a number of occasions that we need to be including them, and we still aren't. So I get that, you know, making whatever presentations or whatever for schools sounds a little bit overwhelming, but if we could just try to schedule some people for our next meeting, I don't think that would take a huge amount of time on our part.
So I don't disagree, and I think we have two people who are willing to present to us. I'm going to say this not as chair, but sort of personally outside of my role is this. There's a division in the Native community about speaking out on these issues, right? So on the one hand, there are Native members, tribal members, who believe it is offensive to ask them to come present to us as to whether a mascot that they feel is offensive should be removed, right? And so this creates some challenges in creating public input because those people who find it offensive are typically less willing to present because it's kind of degrading to come and say, yes, that thing is offensive to me, and could you please do something about it? So to Ms. Delano's point, right, those tribal members are willing to be involved and speak when the decision is imminent, right? And so my concern is in how we find this balance, that if we say we have input now, it favors some positions over others. And I'm not sure how to rectify that. I don't really know, but that's a concern I have personally. Mr. Tebow. He's working on it.
Sorry about that. Yeah, it had shrunk on the screen there and I couldn't find the unmute button. So to your point about when a decision is imminent, that's when some groups will be willing to speak to us. I think maybe that's what this subcommittee could do, is to establish a timeline, because we were expecting a presentation today, and I understand and respect, communication can be a challenge, and that's fine. But if we allow ourselves to continue to be delayed and not progress, we'll never get to that point where a decision is imminent by this subcommittee. And so
can I interrupt real quick, Mr.
Sure.
Be clear that what Ms. Delano has said and what members of her group have said, Massachusetts, is when the school committees.
Sure.
Go ahead. Sorry.
Right, sure. So, but I don't think the school committee will get to that point until the subcommittee has made some recommendation,
That's the
right?
conundrum, right?
Right. So I think if this subcommittee could just establish a timeline, like this is our timeline for making a recommendation to the school committee, then maybe that would, at least keep us on track to kind of get to that point. I think that would be helpful, because what I would not want to see, the Cleveland baseball team, right, just got around to changing their mascot. And one of the resources that was shared by the council that emailed us today was a 1997 paper written about Chief Wahoo, right? So I'd hate to be around in the year 2047 and still talking about, this and not have moved forward. So I would love for this subcommittee to just establish some kind of a timeline for when we are gonna feel we're gonna be reaching a point to make a recommendation.
Right. And I think the other complicating factor that I want to is, as always in the last, it's forever now, is COVID, right? The idea is that originally this meeting was going to be our public comment. And we agreed that we wanted to allow the public to speak. And then the pandemic happened. And that's the other thing. Like, I don't know when we're going to be able to do public comment. Okay, you can't pay me $1 million to moderate an online discussion on this issue, right? If someone else wants to figure that out, I would be happy to let you do that. But my concern is are we willing, this is something we should discuss as a committee, are we willing to move forward without public comment if it comes to that? Ms. Amaro, Ms. Murphy, and then Mr. Tebow. But Ms. Amaro.
My thoughts on that, certainly we can't, I agree with you, Ross, what you're saying, we don't want 15, 20 years down the line, nothing, to have happened either way. But that's where the education piece I feel is really important, because I just looked it up this morning just to see where it is. And, the bill that sits in the state legislature had been sitting there since March, and on July 19th, it was favorably reported out of the Joint Committee on Education, and it literally sits in the Senate Committee Ways and Means. So we might not have to, that deadline for the topic of whether or not the mascot stays may be decided for us before we get to it, which is where I feel like that education and honoring and that common ground piece is really critical. Meanwhile, on top of all the COVID get back to school stuff.
Ms. Murphy.
I was just going to say that I agree with Mr. Tebow. I think that a timeline is really important on this at this point. I understand the competing priorities. I don't think that we should be putting something else on the plate of the administrators to try to tackle large project management at this time. But I do think that this committee needs to keep moving this forward. And I do think that it is possible to do public comment online, and given the state of the way that everything's going, I think we should probably try to figure out how to do that. And I did look up today, actually on that Google Doc, there was some information on the Hanover public school system and their change, and they actually on their website have really clear documentation of all of the steps that they took and how they communicated that publicly. And they did do public comment electronically last fall. Actually, the timeline is quite similar to what we're heading into right now. So I didn't dive too deeply, but they gave instructions on how you would make comment and how they were going to work it and everything like that. It's available on their website. So I'm guessing there's probably a couple other resources like that from the various towns that have made similar actions. And I think using the Zoom webinar format, like we can figure some of that out. I have big reservations about saying let's try to wait until we can do it in person, because it does not seem to be trending like that's going to be possible anytime soon.
Mr. Tebow.
So I was just going to ask, where this is a subcommittee and we're making a recommendation to the school committee, I was just going to pose the question to other committee members, how important public input is for this subcommittee. I think public input is important. I don't know that it needs to be to this subcommittee. To your point, Dr. Jenkins, we're not making a decision that is binding in any means. We're making a recommendation to the school committee. So I respect the authority and the responsibility the school committee will have to act on whatever recommendation we make. And I certainly value the importance of public input in that venue, but I wonder if, again, I wouldn't want to see that be the reason we get stalled in terms of making any progress in this subcommittee. That's all.
So let me suggest we've talked about, back to Ms. Chamberlain's point about bringing sort of native voices, right? Mr. Ventura is a member of the Gay Head Wampanoag tribe, right? As is Mr. Andrews, and Ms. Maltese Andrews. We could have them present. The NCAI is also, right, a tribal organization. So in terms of doing a timeline, those are tribal members that represent two different sides of the issues. That could be step one in our timeline, is hearing those presentations and hearing those voices, to Ms. Chamberlain's point. Step two, if someone would like to volunteer, right, to figure out how to run a webinar, maybe work with Mr. Galashaw. We don't have to, but we could do a public comment. We don't have to Mr. Tebow's point, because when it gets on the agenda, the school committee, it will be subject to public comment, but we can, having two opportunities for public comment would be fine. I just don't have the bandwidth at this time to figure out how to do that webinar. So that might be step two. And then step three is perhaps those are the two things that we need to do to when we're ready. Decision point would be after those two things. Ms. Chamberlain, you had your hand up. You want to make a point?
I mean, I don't know if Mr. Galashaw or Mr. Parati would be willing to work with us to figure out a way to do an online forum, but if Miss Murphy and I and one of them could work on it, I think we could figure it out, especially if, as she said, she already saw some things that might be helpful to us that other communities have done. So I'd be willing to volunteer for that. I'm volunteering you also, Elizabeth.
So if you two
That's fine.
to do that, I think that would be great. Do we then want to give you guys a little bit of time? I will contact Mr. Ventura and Mr. Pereira and Mr. Andrews and try to find a date. I want to say like no earlier than mid-September, because I know that seems like a long time, but I know the teachers and the principals and the administrators need to focus for like the next month on getting the schools up and running. So we can I will work with them to find a date maybe in sort of mid-September for them to do those presentations. And then maybe looking at end of September for public comment. That gives us like another month to set that up. And then we can do a meeting after that and decide to make a decision on that. Does that work for everyone in terms of timeline? I'm seeing a lot of nods. Okay, that's
Mr. Parati or Mr. Galashaw, which one should I contact about working on that?
I would start
I
with
strongly suggest Mr. Parati, but because I open my mouth, you'll be contacting me. No, I'm just teasing. We'll work it out. Technically, we'll work it out.
Thank you, Mr. Galashaw. Okay, so I think we have a step there. I'm gonna, rather than us setting a meeting date and inviting Mr. Ventura and Mr. Pereira, I'm going to ask them for dates that work for them. And then we will set that up sometime in the mid-September range, like hearing that. And so that would then give us a timeline. I will also say this, I don't want to put down the things that Miss Murphy talked about. But if we do this in terms of this timeline, I think this gives the administration, teachers, right, time to open up the schools and get breathing. And then our next step can be this, what we're going to do on this. And so to that end, I think we as a committee, as part of our mission, I'm asking for your affirmation that we are committed to doing this sort of work and inviting our tribal partners in to do these public education displays. I think that's an important part of our mission that we can work on, and maybe work with Miss Chamberlain and her, what are you, the Multicultural Club, Miss Chamberlain, and some other groups, getting some student groups once they're back in school up and running to do some of this work. Because, again, I think it would be really great to engage our students on this. And so we can sort of explore that. Does that seem right to everyone? Does anybody have questions, comments? This is good, but it's hard because you have to process everything like on the spot, right? I totally understand what open meeting law is, but it's like, I feel like my brain gets tired after these meetings because the gears are spinning all the time, right? Ms. Murphy.
Sorry, I would just say one more thing that I think it is helpful for us to think. I think a timeline for where we're going with this next is super important, and we're on a good path for that right now. I also think that by not losing sight of the educational piece as we work towards that goal can help us, again, going back to the comments in some of those letters, so much of this debate becomes sort of like more of like a scarcity mindset, right? Like, I don't want anyone to tell me what I can't do or what you're going to change. And we need to look at this more in terms of like the opposite would be like an abundance mindset, I think, right? Like, what are all the different ways that we can bring this positively to the forefront for our students and our families and our community? And the more we can be thinking about this as a larger diversity, equity, inclusion issue than just a yes or no on a single vote is going to get us more in the direction on all these other types of issues. I think that we hope that this committee will ultimately go.
Right. Yeah, and I think that's really important to reiterate is that I think to go back to Ms. Amaral's point about sometimes the reporting can be very simple on this, that this committee is just this, we're the Mascot committee. But I think we're all here because it's more than that, right? That we're committed to say we make this decision and hand this off to the school committee in October or whatnot. We're not going to go away, right? There's more work to do and more issues to work at, and this is a continuing effort. And so both, right, are related to education and to just, not just on this issue, but other issues as well, that we'll continue to work on this. All right, I have a child to pick up in a few minutes, so I'm either going to hand this off to Ms. Amaral. I don't want to stifle discussion, but I do need to go in a couple minutes. Are there other comments, questions, suggestions? I think this is good. I think we have a plan. I will be back in touch with you once I have sort of a date from them that works. And whoever can make it, and we know that this is always recorded. Mr. Parati puts it up on the website. And so I'll arrange for those presentations. And Ms. Chamberlain and Ms. Murphy, thank you for volunteering to work on the webinar. And then we'll meet after those two events and make our sort of decide, how we're going to pass this along. If there's nothing else, I would entertain a motion to adjourn.
I make a motion that we adjourn.
Ms. Amaral made this motion. I have a second.
I'll second.
Oh, thank you. All right. So I have a motion and a second. Is there any discussion about our motion to adjourn? All right. So I need to roll call this. Mr. Hayes.
Here.
You'd say yes or no. Yes, you don't want to stay here, right? Yes. Okay. Chivo.
Yes.
Ms. Bloom.
Yes.
Ms. Chamberlain.
Yes.
Ms. Massari.
Yes.
Ms. Murphy.
Yes.
Ms. Scott.
Yes.
Ms. Amaral.
Yes.
And I am also a yes. Thank you, everyone. It's always a pleasure. You guys have lots of great ideas. And I super appreciate everyone taking time out of their summer, a busy time of the summer to meet with us tonight. So have a good evening, and I will be in touch soon.
So Sandy and I went to work at